By early 1943, the Japanese Empire was at its height. The country had occupied Malaya and Burma, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia today. These territories had become vital sources of strategic supplies such as oil and rubber. Now the United States laid plans to roll back the Japanese gains. The aim was to cut the country's supply lines by seizing the occupied territories. Japan could then be gradually strangled to death. But to win in the vast expanse of the Pacific, the US would need to develop new forms of mobile warfare. They would be based on amphibious landings supported by aircraft flying from carriers. The Japanese, unable to match American firepower, resorted to increasingly desperate measures. The country fell back on ancient notions of military honor to create suicide units. The result would be a terrible loss of life. This would be a decisive phase in the war in the Pacific and would mark the end of Japan's dreams of empire. But this was to come. Back in the spring of 1943, the US military chiefs faced a dilemma. They had been presented with two options for the defeat of Japan. The flamboyant US Army General Douglas MacArthur, commander of the US and Australian forces in the Southwest Pacific, favored a primarily land-based route. His idea was to seize the Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, and the Philippines. They could then be turned into a strategic barrier that would cut off Japan from its newly conquered lands in Burma, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Japan would be starved into surrender. Equally importantly, this plan would mean MacArthur could repay a debt. Earlier in the war, he had been kicked out of the Philippines by the Japanese, and he had promised to return to liberate the country. But the US Navy had a different idea. It would bypass the heavily defended Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, and the Philippines. Instead, it would seize a string of much smaller islands scattered across the Central Pacific and close to the Japanese homeland. Rather than a barrier, the US would have a series of strategic bases from which to attack Japan's supply lines. They argued it would be swifter and much more economical. The American military command put off the decision. Both the Army and Navy were told to go ahead. In June 1943, MacArthur's plan was launched. It was called Operation Cartwheel. The first target was the major Japanese military base at Rabaul on New Britain in the Solomon Islands. It would be a two-pronged attack. The eastern prong fought its way up through New Georgia and Bougainville. The western prong battled its way through Papua New Guinea. But the virtually impenetrable jungle and unhealthy climate made progress slow. It was nearly 9 months before the pincers met, and the Japanese base at Rabaul was isolated. Meanwhile, as the US Army took control of the Solomon Islands, the US Navy mustered a mighty fleet. It included the first 4 of the brand new Essex-class aircraft carriers. They were bigger and faster than anything before. The new carriers were equipped with outstanding new planes like the Hellcat and Corsair fighters, Helldiver dive bombers, and Avenger torpedo bombers. Together, they both outperformed and outnumbered their Japanese opponents. The Navy's first targets were the Japanese garrisons on the coral atolls of Tarawa and Makin in the Gilbert Islands. These were close to some of the most important supply routes across the Pacific. For a week, the atolls were bombed by carrier-based aircraft. Then, on November the 20th, 1943, there was an amphibious landing. Makin was captured with little difficulty. But Tarawa was a different story. Reconnaissance had failed to reveal that the water was too shallow for the landing craft. As the Marines waded ashore, they came under intense fire. The island was honeycombed with fortified machine gun nests. US troops who made it to dry land were pinned down on the beach. By the end of the day, over 1,500 of the 5,000 US Marines landed had been killed or severely injured. Over the next 2 days, frontal assaults pushed the Japanese back inch by inch. Very often, only flamethrowers could eliminate the Japanese strongpoints. It took 3 days before the last pocket of Japanese resistance was wiped out. Of the 4,200 Japanese troops on the island, only 17 were captured alive. Tarawa was a terrible forerunner of what was to come. The Japanese had shown that there would be no question of surrender. They would fight to the death. It was a grim prospect.